Welcome to the Reynolds School of Journalism's 2021 First Amendment Forum. My name is Patrick Feil. I'm Assistant Professor of Media Law at the Reynolds School, and I'm here to welcome you, introduce our illustrious guest and moderator, and set the stage for our discussion. First, some thanks. Warren and Janet LaRude's generous First Amendment endowment helps make this event possible. Warren is Professor Emeritus at the Reynolds School and longtime media law professor, and he and Janet are committed to ensuring the First Amendment remains a core value at the University of Nevada. I'd also like to thank KUNR, Reno Public Radio, for their promotional support for this event. And we couldn't pull the event together without the fantastic administrative and technical support of Dean Al Stavitsky, Barbara Colbert-Trainer, Jessica Fagundes, and Michelle Rabelati. In 2016, after being arrested for leading an armed occupation of a wildlife refuge in Oregon, rancher and activist Ammon Bundy said, "We had guns there because if we had them, the government would respect us and allow us to speak. If we didn't have guns, they would do what they do to other protesters. They would have tased us, zip-tied us, and hauled us off." This contention that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to ensure the effective use of the First Amendment raises a question of fundamental rights. How should we view the interaction between the constitutional right to free expression and the constitutional right to bear arms? Recently, we've seen speech and guns cross paths, particularly in the context of political protests across the country. Should we see this as two bulwarks created to stop tyranny, working together in concert, endorsed by the founders? Or does the presence of guns at a protest pose the type of threat to democratic dialogue the founders would have rejected? The answer to this and any constitutional question requires nuance. And here to help us sort through it on free speech and firearms is Professor Gregory Magarian. Professor Magarian is the Thomas and Carol Green Professor of Law at the Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. He teaches and writes about US constitutional law, focusing on the freedom of expression. His first book, Managed Speech, The Roberts Court's First Amendment, was published in 2017 by Oxford University Press. His research and writing also examined church and state, firearms regulation, and regulations of the media and the political process. His work has been published in the Michigan Law Review, Texas Law Review, George Washington Law Review, and other leading law journals. He's made numerous scholarly presentations and has taught and lectured at universities around the world. Professor Magarian received his BA from Yale and his JD, as well as a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan, where he was editor-in-chief of the Michigan Law Review. He has served as a law clerk for Justice John Paul Stevens of the US Supreme Court and Judge Louis Oberdorfer of the US District Court for the District of Columbia. He practiced law at Jenner and Block in Washington, D.C., and taught at Villanova University before joining the Washington University faculty in 2008. Here to moderate what is sure to be a robust Q&A is Dr. Amy Payson. Dr. Payson is Associate Professor of Communication Studies here at the University of Nevada, Reno, and Chair of the Faculty Senate. She is a critical rhetorician studying dissent and from the perspective of social movement and counter-public theories to understand the ways dissent is enabled and constrained. Among her recent work is the co-edited volume, What Democracy Looks Like, The Rhetorics of Social Movements and Counterpublics, published by the University of Alabama Press. Dr. Payson and I have been collaborating on research investigating rhetoric around the First and Second Amendments surrounding incidents involving armed occupations of public lands in Nevada and Oregon. We'll begin with Professor Magarian's remarks, which have asked him to keep to about 20 minutes, and then we'll proceed with questions and answers and discussion moderated by Dr. Payson. So with the majority of our time devoted to that, we're going to need your questions. You can submit them via the Zoom Q&A function you can see on your screen, or via Facebook Live if you're joining us there. Feel free to submit questions at any time. And with that, I will cede the digital podium to Professor Magarian. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, Patrick, thank you for that introduction and for your very kind invitation to do this talk tonight. And I want to thank Amy as well in advance for moderating. It is great to be with you all. I wish I could be there physically. I imagine it's kind of hard to have a dull visit to Reno, but I have figured out how to do that through the simple expedient of staying in St. Louis while doing it. But it is still great to be here. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I know that after what for many of you is a long day of Zooming for work, probably the last thing you want to do is more Zooming for fun. And so I appreciate your giving us this time tonight. So in 2008, the Supreme Court in the case of Heller versus District of Columbia held for the first time that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. Many people, both advocates and critics of gun rights, see a close parallel between the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms and the First Amendment's protection of free speech. These people argue that those two rights, for better or for worse, draw on similar justifications, and serve similar social functions. Tonight, I want to first build up that comparison between the First and Second Amendments, and then to break it down. In my view, both the First and Second Amendments are fundamentally meant to foster, in different ways, a democratic government and society. But while the First Amendment has proved its deep value for promoting democracy, I believe the Second Amendment does not promote, but in fact impedes democracy. So I want to start out by talking about some different ideas that different people have expressed about ways in which the First and Second Amendments align. So one version of this comparison is what we could call the popular libertarian view. Pretty straightforward, the idea that the First and Second Amendments both fundamentally serve to promote human autonomy. Under this view, the First Amendment, free speech, is primarily about getting to say whatever you want to say, whenever and however you want to say it. And the Second Amendment is understood in a very similar way. The Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms so that you can have whatever guns you want to have, take them where you want to take them, for whatever purpose that you choose to use them for. There's a different view of the alignment of the First and Second Amendments that has been promoted by the current Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, which again is responsible for the birth, essentially, of Second Amendment law as a meaningful legal doctrine. As Patrick mentioned in the introduction, I've actually written a book about the First Amendment side of this comparison, so I won't belabor it too much. But basically, in my view, the Roberts Court's First Amendment jurisprudence traces this path that I've referred to as managed speech. And the basic idea is the Roberts Court takes the First Amendment, takes free speech seriously within limits. Generally, the Roberts Court has very vigorously protected the First Amendment free speech rights of institutional, powerful, wealthier, what the court views as responsible speakers. And on the other hand, when the Roberts Court has confronted free speech claims from more marginal, ragtag political dissenters, sort of unsavory political speakers, the court has been more likely to let the government maintain significant control and impose significant constraints on those people's expression. And so you put these tendencies together, and the Roberts Court has given us a robust view of free speech for speakers that the court sees as likely to promote and sustain social and political stability. The speakers who are more likely to disturb social and political stability get the short end of the First Amendment stick. I think it's possible to see Heller versus District of Columbia and the Roberts Court's follow-up decision, McDonald versus City of Chicago, the other major Second Amendment decision that the court has handed down, in a very similar way to that sort of managed speech model of the First Amendment. The Roberts Court in Heller and McDonald emphasizes as the basis for the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, individual self-defense, the idea that people should be able to have guns to protect themselves against threats. So this too is very much a vision grounded in social stability and political stability. The idea that an armed populace will hold off threats by the force of violence, or the at least the possibility of violence, and therefore maintain a sort of social equilibrium grounded in everybody basically being armed. And so in that respect, the Roberts Court's Second Amendment, like its First Amendment, promotes, fosters a certain vision of social and political stability. There's a third view of how the First and Second Amendments align, and this one I actually happen to put a lot of stock in myself. I see it as grounded in pretty reliable and credible constitutional theory and history. And this is the idea that Patrick alluded to in his introduction, that both the First and Second Amendments, in their different ways, promote and preserve democracy. The First Amendment version of this democratic theory of rights is pretty familiar. It's a view that a lot of academics and judges at different times have advanced, one that I've argued myself in a lot of different settings. Basic idea is that free and open public discussion is necessary for democratic self-government to work. Speech keeps us informed, gives us a way to work through our disagreements, and crucially, also lets us propose and advocate political and social change. The Second Amendment version of the sort of democratic theory of rights holds that an armed populace is necessary to ensure that the people retain control of their government. Under this theory, if the government becomes overbearing or tyrannical, the armed public will rise up in rebellion and restore proper, legitimate democratic authority. Now, for a lot of people, I think the First Amendment democratic theory is possibly persuasive, certainly not terribly threatening or unusual, where the Second Amendment democratic theory may seem quite strange and potentially menacing, given the idea of preserving democracy through violence. The funny thing is, though, that of these two theories, the First Amendment democratic theory is more easily contestable, and the Second Amendment democratic theory, I think, is more historically and theoretically grounded. On the First Amendment side, as I said, I've defended this democracy-based theory of free speech, but a lot of people take issue with it. In First Amendment circles, you basically hear three pretty common arguments for how the First Amendment protections for free speech can be justified. One is one I alluded to a couple of minutes ago, the autonomy-based justification, the idea that the Constitution protects free speech as a way of fostering individual autonomy. Another familiar view is one we associate with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in his opinion in the Abrams case back in 1919, the idea that we need constitutionally protected free speech in order to facilitate the search for truth, what Holmes referred to as the marketplace of ideas, the idea that we can better understand and apprehend truth through free and open debate. So very similar to the democratic theory, but not limited to democratic politics. So the democracy-based theory of free speech has to constantly contend and compete with these alternative theories. In contrast, the Second Amendment really was, I think, and on the best accounts that I've ever seen, is really about this democracy-preserving idea. And the reason we know that, the primary reason we know it, is that the Second Amendment actually has, unlike any other constitutional rights provision, an explanatory preamble. Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So unlike other rights provisions that just speak in declarative terms, the Second Amendment actually explains what it's about. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And if you look at that language in historical context, it really was about this idea that the popular militia, the armed populace, would serve as a counterweight to government power and a check against government tyranny. So I think the idea that the First and Second Amendments are both grounded in this commitment to preserving, sustaining democracy is a very sound premise. All right, now having established that, I want to talk about various ways in which, in my view, the First and Second Amendments diverge and actually conflict. And in talking about these conflicts, I definitely want to keep the idea and the theme of democracy very much in the foreground, because I think it's very important for understanding what the First and Second Amendments really do, for better and worse. My main argument, my central argument, is that constitutionally protected free speech is good for democracy, while constitutionally protected gun rights are by and large bad for democracy. And I'm going to make that argument at three different levels. The first level is one of practical reality. Put it simply, gun rights and gun rights claims undermine free speech in a lot of different settings. Most familiar example of this is, again, one that Patrick referred to in his introduction, and that is the situation of armed political protest. We've had vivid illustrations of this phenomenon in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville several years ago. More recently, this past summer, in Black Lives Matter protest in my home state of Wisconsin, in Kenosha, where an armed counter-protester killed two protesters. And what we see in these situations is that the presence of guns at protests undermines the expressive function of protests, what protests are designed to do, in a variety of ways. Guns at political protests raise tensions. They intimidate unarmed protesters, and they affect, in a couple of different potential ways, policing of protests. And this can cut, again, in a couple of different directions. In Charlottesville, after the fact, the police there talked about how they felt outgunned. The governor of Virginia said the police couldn't stand up to the armed protesters because the protesters had heavier weaponry than the police did. In other situations, the presence of guns at protests becomes an inducement or spur to over-policing, where police basically get or express the idea that all the protesters are armed, they're all a threat, and therefore it is justifiable to crack down on the protesters, never mind which ones are and are not actually carrying weapons. Another example of how gun rights undermine free speech is one that may be familiar to a lot of folks in this audience, and that is the growing movement toward mandatory campus carry. An increasing number of state legislatures are forcing state universities to permit concealed carry on campus. Studies show that campus carry makes both professors and students less likely to discuss controversial subjects in the classroom. And then there's a set of situations in which advocacy of gun rights and claims made on behalf of gun rights have had the effect of suppressing various forms of public discussion and information about guns. To take one example, Congress for more than 20 years banned federal funding, all federal funding of research on gun violence. And Congress continues to avoid funding that kind of research. This ban has denied the public valuable information about gun violence, information that's essential for an informed political debate about gun policy. Pro-gun legislatures are starting to suppress political speech in the name of gun rights. We saw an example of this. You may remember a couple of weeks ago after Georgia enacted its new voting suppression bill, Delta Airlines, among other corporations, spoke out against that bill, and the legislature threatened to retaliate by removing a jet fuel tax that Delta obviously benefited from. This was actually the second time the Georgia legislature has made that move. A little over a year ago, they made the same move when Delta ended a promotional discount that it had previously offered for NRA members. Delta, other airlines have a lot of different promotional offers for group members. In the wake of, I can't remember which mass shooting it was now, Delta said, okay, we're not going to do that for the NRA anymore. And the Georgia legislature made the same threat. Pretty clear First Amendment violation, as it happens, for a state government to threaten direct retaliation against a private speaker, in this case, a company, for expressing a political viewpoint. And then one more example, Florida several years ago enacted a law called the Firearms Owners Privacy Act that barred physicians from talking to their patients about gun violence. This one got struck down by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals as a violation of the physician's First Amendment rights. So in all these different settings, advocacy claims made on behalf of gun rights have ended up suppressing public information. All right, so that's all at the level of practical reality, direct conflicts between gun rights and speech rights. Another level at which we can see the clash and divergence between these two rights is at the level of democratic theory. And not to get too fancy about it, free speech resonates with a lot of very familiar core ideas that we in the United States, maybe not uniquely, but certainly distinctively advance about our democratic traditions. At the same time, gun rights undermine and clash with those same ideas. One such idea is democratic pluralism. Free and open political discussion facilitates democratic pluralism. Every form of social organization originates from ideas expressed through communication. Cultural formation happens through communication. Communication is essential to ordinary human interaction. It lets people sustain and develop different ways of living with and around each other. In contrast, guns foster exactly one form of social organization: stability, I was alluding to before, enforced by the threat of violence. And guns thwart other forms of social organization that don't depend on the enforcement of stability through threats of violence. Almost no one objects to speech or communication in principle, but many people, of course, object to guns and gun proliferation in principle. And that distinction illustrates the more limited scope of social organization that gun rights promote and support. Another important democratic value, core democratic value in our society, is full and equal democratic citizenship. Free speech promotes full and equal democratic citizenship, at least sometimes, a lot of the time. Certainly speech causes harm in the form of hate speech and other kinds of attacks on vulnerable groups. But through all of that, for all of that, expressive freedom also gives vulnerable groups, disempowered people, a way of resisting entrenched power. In contrast, the gun rights movement and the gun culture of the United States have always been dominated by empowered people, basically relatively affluent white men. Gun rights advocates often claim that guns help numerical and political minority groups to resist violence and repression. But in reality, the opposite is true. Guns simply turn outnumbered minorities into outgunned minorities. Guns, we well know, disproportionately ravage communities of color. They fuel domestic violence against women. guns make full and equal democratic citizenship harder for a lot of people in our society to achieve. And finally, a democratic value that I place a lot of emphasis on in the work that I do, I've already mentioned it a couple of times tonight, is the balance that vital democratic society requires between societal and political consensus and societal and political change. Speech facilitates, mediates between consensus and conflict, consensus and change. Speech can both foster social dynamism, promoting important changes in society. Speech can also help to sustain and maintain social stability, and speech allows people to argue about and work out what balance we want between stability and dynamism. In contrast, guns are designed for conflict, and somewhat paradoxically, because they're designed for conflict, the only state of social dynamics that guns really work to sustain is social stability. You got two options with guns: you use them or you don't. And even gun rights advocates would generally say that the preferred option is not to use guns. So guns end up functioning most of the time as a way of a vehicle for maintaining a kind of uneasy social equilibrium through a kind of tense stability born in concern about the possible outbreak of gun violence. Nothing about gun proliferation promotes any kind of social change other than more gun proliferation. All right, so I've talked about practical reality, I've talked about democratic theory, and now finally I want to talk about history, in particular constitutional history. The First Amendment has been a part of our constitutional law for a century. Of course, the First Amendment has been a part of the Constitution for much longer than that, but the Supreme Court actually started deciding First Amendment claims just over 100 years ago, beginning in 1919. Within a decade of the Constitution's ratification, the controversy over the Alien and Sedition Acts established the importance of unfettered political debate. So even though there wasn't formal First Amendment law until the early 20th century, there was a strong consciousness of what we could call First Amendment values, the importance of free speech and particularly free and open political debate, going back much further in our history. Most people in our society, for most of our history, have broadly agreed that the Constitution should robustly protect free speech, and that at least one important justification for doing that lies in the integral value of speech for democracy. In contrast, the political justification for gun rights, the idea that guns are a way for the armed populace to maintain democratic legitimacy and resist tyranny, that justification lost credibility almost before the ink dried on the Bill of Rights. Early frontier rebellions, the Whiskey Rebellion, Shays Rebellion, showed vividly that even our more homogeneous early population was never going to achieve consensus about what constituted government tyranny. And in addition, even in that age of relatively primitive firearms and a nascent national military, people quickly came to see the implausibility of armed resistance against governmental authority as a serious mechanism for preventing tyranny and maintaining democracy. The Second Amendment as a meaningful legal doctrine is only 13 years old. The Second Amendment sat in mothballs for more than 2 centuries before the Heller Court dusted it off and rewrote it for a purpose, individual self-defense, that it was never meant to serve. In short, our history has held a contest between public debate and popular insurrection as engines of democracy. The First Amendment won that contest. The Second Amendment lost, and it was not remotely close. So at each of these levels, practical reality, democratic theory, and history, I believe that free speech promotes and advances democracy, while gun rights impede and undermine democracy. And for that reason, along with a variety of others, I believe the Supreme Court wrongly decided Heller. I don't think the Second Amendment should have any legal force or effect. Obviously, that is a minority viewpoint. It may suggest that I'm hostile to gun possession. And if I'm answering that question, I guess I would say yes or no, or really more accurately, I would say yes, and who cares? I, like all of you, have exactly one vote in exactly one state. If the Second Amendment disappeared tomorrow, gun rights in this country would remain robust, for better or worse. The legislature in my home state of Missouri can barely get out of its own way in passing an endless parade of legal protections for gun owners. Congress, despite such limited measures as the assault weapons ban, a couple of decades ago, has never really come close to passing any serious federal restriction on gun possession or gun proliferation. A lot of people believe that private citizens should be able to have guns for self-defense. However strongly I oppose gun possession, I respect the viewpoint of people who just as strongly favor gun possession. I respect their viewpoint because I live in a democratic society that protects free political debate. Our society, in my view, should work through the pros and cons of gun possession, just like we work through other contentious policy debates through democratic politics. We need constitutional protection for speech as a precondition for democratic politics. Gun possession, in my view, is not special that way. It should be just another political issue that we all need to figure out together. So with that, thank you all for listening to my spiel, and I am looking forward to the discussion and to your questions.
So thank you for that discussion. And just a reminder for those who might have joined in late, or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, make sure that you put your question into the Q&A and it'll come back here towards the panelists, and we'll try to get to those questions as much as we can. So I might start out with, since you ended on, sort of showing that guns are the antithesis to speech and democracy. Some might claim that there is a symbolic use of guns or a need for guns to be part of protests. So for example, open carry protesters who are saying that carrying their gun out in public is normalizing and is part of their advocacy, in as much as we might have seen some kiss-ins, for example, in advocating for gay marriage. So where would you, if there is a place for guns to have a symbolic purpose, potentially protected under the First, what might that be? Or is the risk of guns too great?
So first of all, I think the premise for what you're asking, the idea that the display of guns has expressive content, is absolutely true. First Amendment law depends on this kind of very unstable but necessary distinction between speech and action. So if that distinction didn't exist, First Amendment law would either prohibit the government from regulating anything or not protect speech in any meaningful way. And we don't like either of those alternatives, so we maintain this kind of conceptual boundary between speech and action. And one of the problems that's come up as First Amendment law has developed is that a lot of human behaviors have characteristics of both speech and action. So the famous example of this that sort of gave rise to this doctrine in the Supreme Court was during the Vietnam War era, when people would burn their draft cards as a form of political protest. Right, that was definitely expressing something, but it was also interfering physically with the mechanism of the military draft. Example I like to give when I teach this stuff is that when the mafia throws a body of a murdered lieutenant on the street with a fish in its mouth or a rat in its mouth or whatever it is. I'm not expert in this mafia stuff. That definitely communicates something. It's also really obviously illegal. And so the First Amendment has to kind of balance these interests in protecting expressive features of action, but preventing the potential dangers of action. Guns in public protests, I make a really difficult sort of instance for this kind of problem. I think it's relatively easy, for the reasons I was suggesting in my talk, to say that guns in sort of volatile political protests with a variety of different factions, something like the Unite the Right rally, are too dangerous to countenance. Unfortunately, I'm quite sure that there are all kinds of well-intentioned, well-controlled people who mean to just display guns for expressive purposes. Unfortunately, the rest of us don't know the difference between those folks and the folks who may very well shoot us. And so there are those effects of intimidation and destabilization. I think there can be instances, the most obvious example would be a political march or rally dedicated to promoting open carry of firearms, where displaying guns would serve a very distinctive expressive purpose. And it might be possible in a situation like that to sort of define it and control it in a way that wouldn't present those dangers of volatility. So I don't think we should ignore or just sort of blow off or deny the expressive force or power of displaying firearms. But I think in many circumstances, probably most circumstances, we need to strike the balance in favor of protecting people from the threat of firearms as opposed to advancing the interest of people who want to express themselves through firearms.
And with that idea of balance, we did have a couple of questions that came in that are somewhat related, which is, again, sort of our fantastic balancing test that we use with the First Amendment. is there some way that we can think of a balancing test, especially when it's related to gun regulation, right? Both balancing the need for people to self-defend, but also protecting oneself from getting shot in mass mass situations. How can we allow for gun rights when, especially in our current American culture, carnage often and mass shootings often accompanies having that right?
Absolutely. And I think that kind of balance is possible. And in fact, even as someone who is very critical of the Supreme Court's sort of elevation of the Second Amendment to the status of an individual right, I think there's a lot in the two big Supreme Court opinions that strikes a fairly cautious note. In Heller itself, the Supreme Court says lots of different kinds of gun regulations would not violate the Second Amendment. Now, the court, like courts always do, is only really deciding the case before it. And the two laws at issue in the two big cases, Heller and McDonald, were both municipal flat bans on handguns in the District of Columbia and then in Chicago. So the only thing the Supreme Court really decided in those cases is that a straight up municipal handgun ban does violate the Second Amendment. Now, I think that's an unfortunate decision. I think it's a decision that's likely to do tangible harm, but nothing about that legal holding, that handgun bans violate the Second Amendment necessarily forecloses any other kind of gun regulation you can think of, including things like bans on semi-automatic weapons, bans on high-capacity magazines, various kinds of background checks, all the different things that we talk about in gun policy debates. Really, nobody in any mainstream gun policy debate is advocating anything that is clearly, or I would say even likely, violative of the Second Amendment under the existing Supreme Court decisions. Now, the court has gotten more conservative. There's now a strong 6-3 conservative majority, which is not something we've seen in a very, very long time. So there's a decent chance that the court will go further in sort of stretching Second Amendment rights. Big question a lot of people ask, what about public carry? Would a disallowance of either mandatory, either open carry or concealed carry violate the Second Amendment? We don't know as a legal matter. It wouldn't shock me, it would disappoint me, but it wouldn't shock me if the Supreme Court said, yeah, the Second Amendment requires at least concealed carry, if not open carry. But there is plenty of space even within this existing in my view, regrettable legal framework for all kinds of responsible gun regulations. There's one other layer to this that I have to point to, and it might get into some other things that we discuss. The big problem with gun regulation, I think everybody knows this, is the sheer number of guns that are present in our country on our streets. It is just I don't even know the number, but it's multiple firearms per resident of the United States. That is, whatever your politics, whatever your theory or philosophy of regulation, that is a really tough problem to address. And so in thinking about gun regulation, we both have to deal, unfortunately, with Second Amendment law and with the even more unfortunate reality that gun proliferation is already way ahead of our regulatory efforts.
We've had a few questions. A lot of our First Amendment scholars that are listening in have a lot of questions about the Second Amendment. Which is that I think some of the critics of the Heller decision have noted that it sort of just leaves this void in terms of explaining what the Second Amendment is for. And in particular, I mean, it doesn't clarify if your self-protection is just in your home, or can you take those guns out in public, as we've seen with some of these militia groups. And then sort of the key part is, as you pointed to in your discussion, that preamble section of that well-regulated militia. What does that mean historically, or might it mean in the present? Is it, like the majority opinion in Heller say, just sort of context, something that we can sort of throw away and think about this in the present? So sort of more specifically then, can you explain a little bit more about that well-regulated militia component of the Second Amendment?
All right, so disclaimer here, I'm not a professional historian. But I've read a lot of history, as most people who think a lot about the Second Amendment have, partially, especially in law, because the Supreme Court in Heller and McDonald really grounded or purported to ground its decisions a lot in history. And so now when people argue academically or litigate gun regulations, history is usually a pretty major focus. With that disclaimer, I've read some history, and I am quite persuaded by the weight of stuff that I've read, and really there's not much of a debate about this among sort of credible historians, that is those who aren't funded by the NRA, working on gun issues, that yeah, the militia clause was meant to create this independent armed stratum of our political society that was outside of any kind of direct military control of the government. There were debates raging at this time about whether a standing army was even a good idea. And so the notion was, okay, we can have this militia. It can be under the direct control of state governments. That's the reference to a well-regulated militia. The idea was that wouldn't be a federal regulation. That would be regulation by the various state governments. That might vary in how it worked from state to state, but generally you'd have, at least the property owning white men would have firearms, and they would be able to take up arms at the instruction of whatever passed for their state militia command. It's very particular, and I got to say, I mean, I've got all kinds of criticisms of the Heller decision, but the Heller decision purports to rest on history. It is remarkably shoddy, and I think remarkably dishonest in its account of history. As you noted, the Heller court basically says, oh yeah, this militia clause, this is just sort of a little explanatory gloss on the main action in the Second Amendment, which is the declarative clause that grants this individual right. That's absurd. I mean, again, there is no other constitutional rights provision, nothing else in the Bill of Rights has this very distinct feature of an explanatory clause. Heller essentially reads that out of the Second Amendment. I mean, I talked before about how First Amendment, nerds like me argue all the time about what the First Amendment is really for. I think the first thing that got me going on writing the original article I wrote about this was just how annoyed I was that, man, if we had a preamble to the First Amendment, that would answer all kinds of questions. We'd know all sorts of useful stuff, and we wouldn't have to constantly fight about these questions of justification. And the Supreme Court comes along in Heller and throws away a perfectly good explanatory preamble. And the reason they did that was that it did not line up with the result that they wanted to reach legally, which was an individual right to keep and bear arms. There's nothing about the text or history of the Second Amendment that seriously supports that legal holding. And the court was understandably queasy about acknowledging the sort of insurrectionist purpose, original purpose of the Second Amendment. So Heller kind of nods faintly in the direction of that justification, but then really doubles down on this idea of individual self-defense, which is entirely anachronistic as a sort of explanation of what the First Amendment is actually doing in the Constitution.
So in looking at where we're starting to see utilizing your First Amendment rights to demonstrate, to protest, but also having that Second Amendment right, which a lot of people think is expansive in having a gun with you whenever you feel like it. Where is the line of when our First Amendment or Second Amendment rights are protected? So for example, following Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally, the ACLU issued guidance that they wouldn't defend somebody on First Amendment grounds if they brought a gun to a protest, basically. But then we get the discourse, especially with the Ammon Bundy case that Patrick and I have been looking at, where the defense in that case says you can exercise both your First Amendment and your Second Amendment rights at the same time, but they're not in conflict and they're complementary. So how might you address or explain whether or not these rights can work at the same time, be complementary, or is that antithetical to how we should think about these rights?
I think if you're Ammon Bundy and you're thinking about what you want to do and how you want to do it, and you say, I can exercise my First and Second Amendment rights at the same time in an entirely complementary way, I'm sure you could pass a polygraph test for sincerity of that conviction. The problem, as I think in many ways is a problem with that lot, is that they are only thinking of themselves, and they're not thinking of the fact that they are part of an organized society with a lot of people who disagree with them, both ideologically and with people who have different levels of risk tolerance when it comes to interacting in an environment with a lot of people who are armed. So I think if we try to step back, step outside the head of any one person, look at some of these scenarios with a mixture of armed and unarmed protesters, and sort of say, okay, if we're going to try to maximize the ability of everybody in this grouping to express their political views openly and without fear. What are we going to do? It seems to me that the clear answer to that question, at least in an awful lot of settings, like the ones that we most commonly think about, the Charlottesville scenario being sort of the model for this, is we can't allow Second Amendment rights to overwhelm First Amendment rights in that setting. There's an interesting sort of dimension to this legally. One thing that the courts in our system have never been good at is resolving disputes where there's sort of competing constitutional rights on both sides. In fact, our legal system refuses to acknowledge that that's a scenario that can even arise. Whenever there's a constitutional rights case, it's always got to be a putative private entity who has a right versus the government that is arguably suppressing or undermining the right. So it's always, you know, private person versus government. But like you're pointing out, there are a lot of situations in which it's really private person versus private person, and the government's got a decision to make about how it's going to try to mediate between different interests that are protected or at least taken seriously by the Constitution. Our courts have never done well with these cases. The best answer that courts generally come up with is to sort of defer to government regulation. Like when the government decides, okay, we're going to strike a balance in favor of this right as opposed to that right. In a lot of situations, the court has said, okay, good, glad, thanks for making that decision for us. We're washing our hands of it. I think the governments, local governments, municipal, state governments have to figure this out. And I think the way, when it comes to, you know, guns and speech, I think the way to figure it out is to acknowledge that free speech is, again, it's universal. It's a capacity that almost everybody can exercise. It is necessary, essential for our political system and for our culture and society generally. And guns aren't. Guns are at best, you know, even if you got nothing against guns, guns are an add-on. Guns are another thing that people can do, another way that people can choose to live in a certain sense. You know, just like having a big car or, you know, going on vacation. I mean, this is stuff that people do. That's what guns are. Speech is of an entirely different quality and importance, I think.
And I think this raises a question just in terms of what hope should we have in terms of speech, keeping our democracy stable, intact, as something that people can participate in, or how seriously might we need to take that there are limits and censorship to First Amendment, or the First Amendment just generally being under attack. And I guess where I'm coming with this question is that, you know, again, for those folks like the militias carrying arms, that they do believe that the federal government has overreached, that there is a reason to either actually use guns to protect rights, democracy, constitution, however they decide it, or for some that would say that the Second Amendment is really a symbolic amendment that says that the people can have the ability or the possibility of having the ability to overthrow the government. So how much should we still maintain or suggest that maybe there is a defendable Second Amendment version, that we do have the right to insurrection to a tyrannous government?
I think there are just a whole lot of problems with the kind of insurrectionist theory of guns, and any one of which is enough to torpedo it. So we've got a model in our history for successful armed resistance to tyranny of a sort, and that's the Revolutionary War. And that's it. Like, there have been plenty of subsequent circumstances in which any number of good people and bad people, good factions and bad factions, have armed themselves. There are instances, although a lot fewer instances than in the kind of romantic narrative of the gun culture, where people have managed to protect themselves. Good people have protected themselves with guns against bad people. But those are dwarfed by the situations in which bad people have been able to engage in mayhem. If you look at every successful, meaningful political movement that has moved our country forward, they have been predominantly, if not exclusively, unarmed. And you don't have to be someone who romanticizes nonviolence to believe this. I'm quite pragmatic when it comes to questions of liberation and oppression. But if we look at the movement for Black liberation in the 60s, the nonviolent elements of that movement ended up a lot more successful than the armed movements. And the armed movements had some pretty good arguments behind them that I would have a hard time sort of shooting down on their own terms. But the bottom line was that armed resistance to oppression didn't work out very well. And now what have we seen? You know, we've got all kinds of injustice to worry about, all kinds of tyranny to worry about, not the kind of tyranny that the gun rights crowd is usually talking about. But we've just seen a nonviolent social protest movement rise up, change the conversation about police violence in this country. And now, at long last, we have a serious conviction in a very high profile case of a police officer for unnecessary violence. I mean, that's as good, you know, we're sitting here today talking about this stuff. That's as good an exemplar as I could possibly hope to hold out about why we should be optimistic about speech rather than violence as a means of sustaining democracy and preventing tyranny. And I guess at a fundamental level, there's one other way to sort of take this on. One of the reasons that speech is an amazing ingredient in a vital democratic society, an amazing sort of engine in a vital democratic society, is because speech by itself isn't threatening. Now, sometimes, as you were sort of suggesting in the question you asked, that can make speech ineffectual or not as effective as we want it to be. But it's also what allows speech to spur social change, because there's no, you know, as long as our government has any semblance of democratic legitimacy, you can't just start shooting at unarmed, nonviolent protesters in the streets. I mean, even Donald Trump managed to get, you know, sort of reach a turning point in his twisted story when he, you know, tried to violently have his people violently push back protesters in Lafayette Square. Like, speech is non-threatening until it changes everything. That is the promise of speech. It doesn't work every time, but it works sometimes. And in contrast, if we want to have any kind of a shot at a democratic society, we've really got two choices. Neither one of them perfect when it comes to violence. That is, either you give the government a monopoly on the use of force, or you have a situation where random insurrection and factional violence is a fact of life. And for my money, the choice of betting on government monopoly on the use of force that can be moved in its worst moments by speech, that's the best bet we've got.
And for those of us that are journalism scholars, communication scholars, obviously we prioritize, we privilege speech. We'll scream from the rooftops that speech is the way to demand action. So if that is the path that we take, jurisprudence takes in to say that we want to protect speech, have a robust protection of speech, and that's the way to get change, then is there still a necessity to have the Second Amendment at all, right? If we take away the idea that the Second Amendment has some dissent potential to it, is there anything that you would say constitutionally makes sense for us to retain in terms of having a Second Amendment?
I have given this question a little bit of thought, not as much thought as I probably ultimately should or will. So my main pitch in my talk tonight was that no, I don't think the Second Amendment has any positive value. I've been able to come up with one potential caveat to that. There is what has now become a kind of obscure branch of equal protection legal doctrine, constitutional doctrine, that says there are certain interests that people have that are not by themselves fully constitutionally guaranteed. The interest in access to elections, the interest in access to judicial process, but that these are important enough values under our Constitution that the government should have to treat everybody equally as far as these values are concerned. So not deny access to the courts to some people, giving it to other people, not deny the right to vote to some people, giving it to other people. And we're talking about this at a level that even transcends obvious fault lines like race, you know, common forms of discrimination. So this idea has been used, for example, to support constitutional holdings requiring the government to ensure that people with physical disabilities have access to government facilities. I think you could come up with a decent argument that gun regulations, that guns are an important enough factor in society, for better or worse, that gun regulations should need to be even-handed, that the government should not be able to treat different communities or populations differently with regard to gun regulations unless there's a particularly good reason. For example, denying access to firearms to people with violent felony convictions or certain kinds of problematic mental health histories. That stuff could still be justified. But the idea would be to protect against the potential for a situation where the government regulated in a way that gave empowered communities more access to guns than disempowered communities. In my paradise, nobody has guns, but I certainly would see a next worst sort of scenario as being one where just a certain faction within society is able to get guns easily and other people aren't able to protect themselves in the same way. So if we're just talking about that kind of relative equality protection, maybe you could ground that right in the Second Amendment, or at least some sort of combination of the Second Amendment and equal protection principles. But beyond that, look, as I said before, I would be very happy for the Second Amendment to just go away and for us to work out our differences about gun regulation the way that we work out all of our other policy disagreements.
There seems to be a trend within Second Amendment legal precedent that saying that it is like speech in terms of whether or not we will regulate it or not. Obviously, with the First Amendment as somewhat of a sacred type of amendment, we don't want to regulate speech because of the potential to use that unequally or to discriminate between viewpoints. And guns seem to work differently, although there's arguments to say that we shouldn't have regulations on guns based on the spaces or locations. And we do have a couple of questions that got put in the chat related to gun-free zone regulations, for example, and whether or not there's some distinction between regulating guns in places that might have more risk of violence or danger versus other places where they might be more safe. So can you comment a bit just in terms of what types of regulations make sense for guns, how that might relate to how we think about it through speech regulations?
So first of all, one of the other things that got me interested in this whole topic to begin with many years ago was the tendency that, early on in the post-Heller years, that some courts and academics were starting to make really kind of simple-minded, I almost hope they were disingenuous arguments about how we have to have these exact parallels between guns and speech. So obviously we could never license people to start a newspaper. That would be a blatant violation of free speech. So therefore, we should never be able to license people as to whether they can have guns either. We would never dream of having background checks against people for being able to use their First Amendment rights. Therefore, it's equally unconstitutional to have gun background checks. And that's ridiculous. I mean, I've tried to point out some ways tonight in which there are meaningful conceptual connections, parallels that we should take seriously in thinking about First and Second Amendment rights. I mean, they're both constitutional provisions that courts have held to prohibit government action subject to balancing tests, but in some sort of absolute way, like not procedural rights, but you can't regulate speech, you can't regulate guns. Okay, so there's a basic surface similarity, but come on, there are all kinds of differences. And the one that you talked about, the sort of zoning type regulations is a really good example of this. One of the most pernicious forms of speech regulation that has been happening for quite a while in our society, usually often in institutional settings, sometimes universities, sometimes around like national political conventions, is the so-called free speech zone. Like, yes, you can protest the Democratic Convention if you want to, as long as you go to this little fenced-in area 6 miles from the convention center. See, we're respecting your First Amendment rights. Well, no, you're not. That's ridiculous. It's almost taunting in how that approach treats First Amendment rights. In contrast, the Supreme Court itself in Heller says that one of the kinds of regulations that is presumptively permissible, at least to some extent, is gun regulations restricting guns in sensitive places. So, and I think most people would have a hard time refuting this. The idea that it is perfectly okay for the government to pass regulations that say, for example, you can't have guns in public schools, you can't have guns in or near places of worship, you can't have guns in courtrooms, you can't have guns in legislative chambers. I mean, this stuff is so obvious that it's almost silly to even talk about it, but there are a lot of settings and ways in which you absolutely could not prohibit or zone speech consistently with the First Amendment, where there are parallels where, yeah, you should absolutely be able to zone guns in that same way, consistent with whatever we take the Second Amendment to mean, even if we take the Second Amendment seriously, as the Supreme Court does. So I think one thing we really need to watch out for is these sort of overly linear, overly simplified parallels between gun rights and speech rights, gun regulations and speech regulations. They're too, again, even if you take Second Amendment rights seriously, even if you favor a vigorous judicially enforced Second Amendment, there are obvious differences between these two phenomena and how they function in society that should justify different kinds of regulations in the two different settings.
And it looks like we have time for one more question, and one just came into the Q&A. And I think it's probably related to our moment in actually thinking about the recent January 6th insurrection, is that we have to sort of grapple with that old incitement danger test of the First Amendment. Can speech actually incite violence? And when we see that false information is much more common, especially in our social media landscape, that may have the potential and risk. Where do we see First Amendment rights going, or what should we be thinking about in terms of regulations, given that we now have seen some incitement to riot potential with speech?
That's a really interesting question, and I think a really hard question. I believe, and I think a lot of people who care about free speech would agree with this in some measure, that our kind of First Amendment tradition, our kind of free speech ideals haven't really had to grapple with anything like mass electronic disinformation. This is a phenomenon that's not really like anything we've seen before. I mean, we certainly have experiences of disinformation in human history. In the US, we've done a pretty decent job throughout our history of resisting, minimizing disinformation compared to some other societies. But now we've got a technological infrastructure that just makes it a completely different kind of problem. I don't have the answer to that. Now, I do think that it's still kind of important to distinguish disinformation from incitement. Incitement has, for good reasons, been a very limited, very narrow doctrine in First Amendment law. First Amendment law has tried to maintain a lot of space for people to express unpopular, provocative, even potentially dangerous political ideas without letting that stuff be legally punishable. So incitement generally, the First Amendment test for incitement generally requires that the speech in question has to directly, immediately incite other people to commit violent actions. The example I give in my First Amendment class is, if you've got a charismatic speaker talking to an armed drunken mob in front of a government building saying everybody should go and kill everybody inside. Okay, that's incitement. But not a lot of other stuff constitutes incitement. Amazingly enough, say what you will about Donald Trump, but the man is an innovator. He managed to give us a really good argument for public political speech that constitutes incitement. And talking about this in the context of guns is worthwhile, because one thing that does change the incitement analysis is the surrounding circumstances. If the people that the speaker is addressing aren't capable of committing meaningful violent action, then no matter what the speaker says, they're likely to be off the hook for incitement. But if you're talking to an armed or violently inclined sizable mob and directing them toward a particular goal, like, for example, the Capitol that is about to steal the election from you by your rhetoric, yeah, that's a serious argument for incitement. But the disinformation problem, it's certainly connected to that, but we can't just, start dragging people out of their houses for lying online. I don't think we can. I think that's very unwise. But I do think we can probably try to think about more systemic regulatory strategies, maybe ways of encouraging, or I hate this verb, but I'll use it just this once, incentivizing social media companies to crack down on flows of information that they can control. I think those are conversations well worth having.
Well, it looks like we are close on time, so I want to give my personal thanks to Professor Magarian for answering all of these questions, a lot of variety of questions that we have here, and thanks to everybody who is listening in. But I'll turn it back over to Dr. Feil to close us out.
Thank you
very
Amy.
much. Thank you very much to both of you. I want to thank Professors Magarian and Payson for a really illuminating conversation and a great one. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us tonight and for asking so many great questions. That's always what we hope for at these events. And I hope to see you all in person at next year's Reynolds School Journalism First Amendment Forum. So thank you very much all, and good night.